Deb, I'm really looking forward to the conversation today, which is all about the value of leadership coaching, especially amidst turbulence and disruption, which we know we're facing in almost unprecedented volume and frequency over the last few years. The other thing I think is really important to note is that you and I both have a very personal connection and personal experience to leadership coaching. Me, so much so that I started my own company around it, but that you've been very vocal about the role of leadership coaching in your own journey as an executive. And then also in your book, Take Back Your Power, that is coming up soon. And so I'd love to just start there, maybe just to talk a little bit about how that development in leadership coaching has really factored into your growth as a leader, and certainly happy to share my thoughts as well.
Yeah, coaching has been extremely transformative to my career. I actually got a coach because I was the problem employee. So unlike maybe you at Tapjoy, where it was an honor to be coached to become a senior executive, I was having a really hard time working with the manager I had at the time. I was really struggling at the company at Facebook. And my skip level manager said to me, I think a coach can really help you. And I thought, is this a punishment or a reward? And, he said, and by the way, and he said, let me think about a good coach for you. And he thought about it. And then a couple weeks later, he said, I have the perfect person. So Katya Verithan is my coach. She coaches a lot of Silicon Valley executive CEOs. She previously had worked in investing. And when I met her for the first time, she was nothing like I thought she was. She had asked me a number of questions. And I remember in our first meeting, she said, someday you'll be CEO. And I'm like, I'm not even a director at Facebook. In fact, I'm here because I'm having problems at the company. She has been my coach since off and on since 2011, so almost 11 years. And I would not be where I am today, but for her support, her ability to really help me think through some of the challenges in the workplace. And part of it is she is so different from me. We joke that most people who met her, she's completely touchy-feely. I am a type A, science-based, like engineering background kind of person. And in a lot of ways, she helped me think through a lot of the challenges at work. And I do talk about a lot of those things in the book. And her biggest question for me over the years, and I joke that every single session is her asking me a different version of this, which is, you know what you need to do. Why are you not doing it? And she never tells me the answer. And I think that the best coaches elicit from you the answer you knew all along. And, each pivot in my career, each opportunity, each setback, she was there side by side with me. And I think that's something which most people don't realize how empowering and how freeing that is to have somebody who can really support you, give you advice, but also help you unblock yourself. I mean, it's really not somebody who's holding your hand and doing it for you. It's somebody to teach you the skills to unblock yourself. There have been periods where I didn't talk to her for 6 months or a year. There have been other periods where I see her every week. But it is really, I always joke that her voice is in the back of my head, reminding me of what I need to do.
Right. It's that voice here on your shoulder, sort of whispering in your ear, right? And, it's so interesting because I have remembered that you said that you and Katie are very different. And that's also very similar to the experience I had with Lori, who is now my co-founder, but started as my coach, which is how I got introduced to coaching. And I remember thinking, she can't be the right coach for me because, she's very, we would say she's more expressive, where I'm a bit more analytical. She sort of really leans into instinct and power and a lot of these topics that I was not very comfortable with. But it ended up being this incredible dynamic where it really challenged me as a leader, because instead of a coach that was corroborating or just helping me feel better about the things that I didn't love or weren't going the way that I often intended, there really was this push-pull of her really pulling me along and challenging me in ways that I think really was a result of that style difference. At Sounding Board, that ends up actually being a factor in how we think about matching coaches to the right coachee, is that you do want a bit of that disparity. You don't want the styles to be too close together, but you still have to be close enough to, of course, be able to create that important connection and that dynamic. Is there anything you can share about that?
Well, I think part of it is in coaching, trust is one of the most important things. It's just somebody who you're living life with, who's giving you advice, who's sitting down with you and helping you work through problems. And trust is more important than commonality. It's more important than anything else. And I think that that is absolutely true. It's somebody who, might be with you. And I didn't realize when I met her, I was supposed to do 6 coaching sessions, and it's been 11 years. So I, and I wish that coaching were much more available. And I have had Katya actually coach many people on my team over the years in short durations. And they just talk about how she unblocked them in just, a small number of sessions. And I think that, I wish I could clone her. Unfortunately, I can't. But I do think scalability of coaching and making it much more accessible to different organizations can unblock so many people. Often people are stuck on 1 or 2 things, and they don't need somebody to hold their hand for 11 years. They actually really need to work through a couple really big things in their lives or their workplace. And once they work through that, they have broken through. And so I do think that, coaching being available and open. And by the way, I don't know if most people know how I met you. I actually wrote an article about coaching and how coaching can be transformative. And Christine reached out and said, hey, just want to let you know, I started this company, and we eventually invested in her company. And now my husband works there. So we're such big fans of Christine and her organization, but it's because I believe in the power of coaching so much that I rarely invest when someone cold called me, by the way. She commented on my post, and but I just really believe in the mission of really unblocking people and making it possible for people to do their best work.
Yeah. And I think, coming back to the title of our webinar and why we're here, a reason why that's more important than ever really has a lot to do with the environment that we're in. At Sounding Board, what we're seeing is that now you obviously have very challenging, issues and big initiatives you have to face as the CEO, myself included. But actually, every single one of our employees, even down to first-time managers or even high potential leaders, have a variation of that they're facing in their everyday work as well. And certainly we've seen that it's been exacerbated because of the move to remote work, because you get a bit less of that osmosis of learning of being in an office environment, or just the connection in that time to be able to engage with people outside of your set meetings. And so I'm curious, at Ancestry, is there anything you can share about some of what you've observed in terms of needs and urgency around leadership for you over the past few years, and whether that's evolved or been different than how it was before the pandemic?
Well, most people don't realize Ancestry is a 35-year-old company. And it's been around for a long time, and it has innovated through many different cycles. But the one thing that's always been in common is that everyone came into work every day. And then the pandemic hit, and it was a very strongly office-based culture, and suddenly everything changed. And, at first we actually were following the Apple model of coming back 3 days a week in September of 2011. And that completely changed when we saw the environment was changing, and people just told us their lives are really different now. And, we went from a company that has been, together physically in a few offices to, we're basically location flexible. And it means that, even if you live in the area, you don't have to come in. And so we encourage you to come in and see your colleagues if you choose to do so, but there is absolutely no requirement to do so. And that's really changed the culture. And I think that, part of the challenge, and Ancestry is still an extremely successful company, and people have powered through and worked incredibly hard during the pandemic. But at the same time, it's really changed a lot of the culture that was, very physical based. It was very, ideas in the hallway, whiteboarding. And, I think we are now evolving so fast. I think if you had asked somebody, hey, in 2019, you asked CEOs and leaders, do you think you could just send everyone home and get rid of your offices or have kind of optional office? 100% of them would have said no, the ones who weren't remote, because they would say our productivity would go down. We were going to struggle. How are we going to build culture? And in essence, the forcing function has forced us to change so quickly. And I think that humans are way more adaptable than we think they are. And so part of that is we've adapted, but we're still missing some things. And I do think that having someone to help you navigate that, having someone to help you lead, especially if you lead an organization through times of transition, that is a hard thing. And it's much harder when you're doing that remotely from your home.
Yeah, well, we had put out a report actually on the state of coaching and thinking about all those different use cases, why you would want to deploy leadership coaching. You know, no surprise, a large majority was really around improving those specific leadership skills. Like you had said, for each individual, there's often one or two skills or capabilities or behaviors that you're trying to shift. For a lot of them, though, they were also really thinking about it beyond leadership, also as a way to increase employee engagement. And I think a lot of that speaks to this idea of us not being able to physically be in the office, managers having less time to be able to engage with all of their team in a broad way, in an individual one-on-one, but that companies are really thinking about what are other ways that I can support my employees. And then, of course, we've heard a lot about the Great Resignation, right before we moved into the incredible market turbulence. But also, as you'd mentioned, it's really also about support and how do you give something to your employees and especially your key talent to think about retaining them and supporting them through a lot of challenges that they're facing, not only in the workplace, but also personally, right? I was supposed to be doing this webinar from Colorado, but lo and behold, my husband got COVID this week. So I had to shift my flight, come home early yesterday. I've got a kid on YouTube probably while we have this hour and talk. But those are the types of things that all of us are facing and all of your employees are facing every single day. And so I do think that one of the things that we've really seen at Sounding Board is that this need for more individualized development and to be able to support these different needs that each of your employees is having has been one of the most critical solutions or ways and approaches that companies are thinking about that. Is there anything that you can share about how Ancestry is approaching some of this?
Well, I think that, one thing that is really important is up-leveling the skills of the team. So we actually have, leadership programs to help elevate our leadership of our managers and our directors. I do think part of it is really helping people lead through a time of tremendous change. And, I think that as a company, we've really committed to helping people make this transition, but it was so abrupt and so different. And, somebody came into the office yesterday and they said, I haven't been in this office in like 2.5 years, and it just,
right.
It reminds you that, this was something that would unheard of, a couple of years ago. And so, leaders in particular, especially managers and directors, are asked to lead through a time of great uncertainty. And so part of it is really kind of elevating our skills through various programs that we have, but also really supporting them through, the work that we do, really kind of supporting one another. I think that part of the work that all companies are facing, and Ancestry is not an exception, is we don't know where it's not like at the end of a flight, the plane lands, right? You don't really understand if this goes on forever, if this is a temporary thing. And so really, one thing that we don't know is there's so much uncertainty ahead, and really helping leaders kind of navigate through uncertainty is part of the work that we need to do.
And maybe to switch gears a little bit, because you started your role at Ancestry pretty close to the last, sort of the onset of the pandemic, and maybe tell us a little bit about your own experience through that.
Yeah, I actually, I started about a year into this. So I started on March 1st, so about a year into the pandemic. And so I've been here. And, to be honest, I took the job having never met anybody in from our investors, our private equity investors. I had, everything was done through Zoom. We tried to get together physically and we just couldn't get it done because there's just, so many cases and it was just really hard to travel. And when I met my leadership team, it was interesting. I didn't realize that they sent out a Zoom link to each of the senior leadership team of Ancestry. And then I didn't realize this, but they didn't realize who I was. They just were given a Zoom link and said, "You're going to meet the new CEO." I think they were in for a surprise. I do not look like
Wow.
the typical CEO. And I said, so the first 5 minutes of each meeting, I said, "Why don't you Google me and then read it before you feel like you need to say something?" And, because it was a shock to them. I realized after the second meeting that people didn't realize who I was. I think, part of it is that there's just so many things that are different. We would have had such a different experience. Onboarding was also difficult. How do you get used to and know a culture when you've never been at the office, right? And my first time in the office was several months after I took the job. And, it has been an incredible honor and opportunity and privilege to be a part of this company. And, but it's also been a challenge because we are going through so much. We had to decide our future, our location strategy, our future of work strategy, how we're going to lead through a time of tremendous change. And I think that still is ongoing, as we face, a lot of economic uncertainty right now as well. How are we going to lead through that? And I think the challenges keep coming, but part of it is adaptability. Helping your organization and helping your leaders be adaptable is the best inoculation against change.
Absolutely. I might share an anecdote about how my coach has helped me navigate through some of this change that we're facing. But is there anything that you can share as you went through that onboarding and all of these new initiatives you had to face that you never had to face before? How did your coach support you through that? Or is there any anecdote you can share about that?
Well, I think the biggest thing is, we talked a little bit about, I actually published a newsletter, so a Substack newsletter, devlu.substack. And I actually shared my journey of accepting the job, starting at Ancestry, my 30, 60, 90-day plan, my listening tour. And I did that in coordination with my coach. So she actually reviewed a lot of those things and she helped me kind of, figure out the best way to do this. I think I think it's very easy as a new leader to be critical and, really kind of being curious rather than critical. And, I did, by the way, at 1 year, I wrote all the avoid the mistakes of starting a new job. And so I wrote a postmortem of my first year as well. Because, as a new leader, you tend to fall into you see the problems because they're so obvious to you, but you join the company because it's so amazing. Right. And I think that having a coach help me work through those things. And I wrote a lot. And I think writing is something that she encouraged me to do as a way to process. For me, writing is actually a great way to process information. And as I write and I share it real time, people are kind of on the journey with me. And so, if you want to join that journey, you're welcome to subscribe to the newsletter. But I share pretty openly about some of the challenges I faced and some of the mistakes that I made.
That's right. And I remember reading your 30, 60, 90-day plan and, following along that journey. On my end, one of the things that happened for Sounding Board is, you talked about investing in us. We ended up closing back-to-back growth rounds as a company just within 2021. And so the company ended up scaling up very quickly, where I suddenly found myself having a very different role as a CEO than I had just a year ago, where now it was much more about engaging employees that I might not have as close of a connection to, being able to communicate priorities, really organizing and orchestrating my communication out as a leader in order to ensure that the employee base really understood where were we going, how were current environment or factors impacting us, my perspectives on that. And a lot of that, my coach actually was able to support me with. Like you said, I'd bounce ideas off of her, come up with structures, and even sometimes get tactical. And sometimes, of course, step back and take that big picture look at what were some of the things that were keeping me from being effective. But that really was such an important support for me throughout this time, because I felt like every month I was facing something I hadn't faced before.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do think, as we go through this period where, of inflation, of uncertainty. There's a war. There's just a lot, and really, coaching and in leading through a time of great uncertainty, especially for our employees. We're just, that's part of the work that I think we're responsible for, but also all leaders are responsible for that. It's not just at the very top, but across an organization. We're asking people to do things that they never would have been asked to do before. Approving whether someone can live in a different state when, we need to figure out the tax situation. Like that is, really challenging. And also, how do we support people through some of the challenges they're personally facing when, their spouse gets COVID. My entire family got COVID, over the course of 2 weeks. And, how do you support someone through that? And it's, these are just challenges that we have to face right now.
I agree. I mean, I think that the reason that I think this has become such a critical issue also is exactly your point, which is if you think about when you were back in the office and you were able to maybe walk around, your presence was there, you could engage with folks in a broader way. Now, so much more of that communication, the decision making on these micro things that have an incredible impact on your employees' lives are now being pushed further and further down into the organization. Otherwise, it'll take too long, right? And so I do think this idea of being able to empower your leaders, but then how do you as an organization then trust their ability and their skill to be able to make those right decisions is something that we're seeing a lot of companies think about, manager enablement and this idea of really being able to activate a broader set of their leaders to be able to disseminate and make more decisions. Yeah. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think we are also going through a time when we're asking frontline managers to just do so much more as well, because there is a lot of distribution of decision making. And I think that's great. I actually think that we should push more decisions down the organization. But how do we do that at a time when people might not, have never been at the office, have rarely met their colleagues, how do you enforce a culture? And I think that, that is something which we're going to continue to evolve as we move towards more, location flexibility across, many different industries.
Is there anything that you can share about how you have tried to approach that culture building or, alignment around the culture at Ancestry?
Well, I think culture is, there's so much that's embedded in the history of a company, the reasons why people stay, the employees that have been a part of the company for many years, but also, the resilience and the evolution and the next chapter of what a company does. And so, one of the things that's really important is alignment around a vision and a mission that everyone can rally around. So some of the work that we've been doing is building Ancestry for All. So, Ancestry has been an incredible company that does really amazing work, but it worked best for people of Western European descent because that's where we had content, that's where we had relationships. So really broadening, diversifying our user base and the support that and offering that we have for a diverse group of people will be part of the work that we do going forward. The other thing is really aligning around a strategy, aligning around, we have our new strategy and it's been published to everybody. We, a lot of that, but it's not just the words on the page, it's actually how you live it. I think sometimes it's easy, you say Ancestry for All, and suddenly it's like, it happens. No, it's actually enforced every single day when you're making choices. And each manager, and each decision, each prioritization really reinforces or goes against what culture you hope to build. And so a lot of that is really building the resilience around, are we aligned on the strategy? Are we aligned on the execution? And how does that all ladder up to the thing that we've all said that we want to do together? And so a lot of that is been the work of, and it's much harder to do when there's, kind of disparate conversations where people are kind of having mostly one-on-one conversations where there's less a chance for people to run into each other and talk about things. And so it's really about kind of also how do you distribute information and communication, internal communications in a way that people can align.
Absolutely. When you, that feels very, very familiar to me as well, because I think, Ancestry, as you said, 35-year-old company has been around for a really long time. Sounding Board, we're a newer company, and yet all of us are focused on the same things, alignment around your vision, alignment then around the strategy to achieve that vision. And then how does that actually translate into the day-to-day goals and the work that each of us are doing, all the way down to your frontline workers. And I think one thing that we have also looked at Sounding Board is just then we've talked a lot about sort of adaptability today, resilience. I think some of the things that we've also seen is that in addition to, we've talked about engagement, but we've seen one, which I'll pull out here, which is that having leadership coaching really also can have a dramatic impact on your employees' perception of the quality of the leadership, right? And this idea that how your leaders show up at every single level matters more than ever as you're trying to align around these strategic initiatives and the vision and the strategy, and that folks really have a deeper connection to almost their manager now than they may have to the organization, because that's the person that they engage with day to day, right? And they may not have as much exposure to the rest of the organization as they did before. And so those are some of the things that we're also seeing, why the leader and their ability to be able to translate that vision, that strategy into the work that your employees are doing day to day has actually really increased in importance, because that presence has become such a larger part of that employee's experience. Have you experienced that at all at Ancestry as well?
Well, I think that, I do think we are looking at a distributed workforce. And so, a lot of the support that we offer has to be, you can't just get everyone in a room. It's very difficult to do that, right? We are doing our leadership summit together in December, and it's at the end of November, beginning of December. And it's hard. It's the first time we've been together. We did the last one virtually it was like 3 days. And you're on Zoom for several hours a day, and it was wonderful. But even then, you aren't physically in the same space. And so we are working on things like that, like leadership training that we do together. How can you asynchronously feel together, right? And I think that, that is something which we're still kind of working through. And we did kind of a check-in summit in between, and it was great to just spend time with each other, but it was virtual. And so we will be doing our global leadership summit together, and it's going to be really exciting. I do think during times of disruption, having support for people, having a place, and as they say, sounding board for our leaders is also, how do you peer coach? How do you support each other? How do you enable your managers to be great support? Also, that is a skill. I feel like we often, we promote the person who's best at their job, but your job changes so much as you rise in the organization, because you go from maybe the best engineer to the tech lead to maybe engineering manager. And each of those roles are completely different. And then suddenly you might be director of engineering. You're leading a few dozen people, and suddenly you're juggling. How do you prioritize? How do you help your team enable? But also, how do you coach them to be better employees? How do you get the most out of them, but also support them through difficult circumstances? And I think sometimes we're asking a lot of people right now, and even more so than ever when there's so many challenges in the world as well as in companies.
And oftentimes the same skill set that makes you a great engineer is not necessarily the same skill set that makes you a great engineering manager or in sales, right? Your top rep, often a very individualized activity where you're managing your own work, very different than running an entire sales team and trying to coach others to be able to reach a team goal, right? And so certainly, of course, at Sounding Board, we believe leadership skills can be learned and be honed and practiced over time. But I think, just being able to name that those are different skill sets, I think can be very powerful for folks, because oftentimes for new managers, they get very frustrated that they were a top performing rep or they were the top performing engineer. And suddenly they find themselves feeling like they're failing, or feeling like they don't have that same level of productivity or maybe the immediate satisfaction from their work as they did when they're a manager versus an individual contributor. And a lot of it and the coaching around that, a lot of it is helping people understand that this is a new skill set, right? And that there are different metrics of success now than they were before when you were an individual contributor.
Absolutely. I remember the first time I became a manager, and I just thought, and I said to my manager, it'd just be easier if I did this myself. Like, it is so hard to lead through other people because you're impatient and you were the very best at what you did, and suddenly you're managing through others. And that impatience, and he said, but that's not scalable. You need to figure out how to enable others to reach that level of mastery, not just do it yourself, because you can't possibly do it yourself all the time. And I think that was an amazing leadership and management lesson. And I think a lot of managers are the best at their craft, but they're the best individual at their craft. And so how do you scale that to 5, 10 people? How do you scale that to managers and managers? I think those are really interesting questions, and leadership development really needs to help say, you know what? Yes, it might be more efficient in the short term for you to do it because you are the master of your craft, but you teaching 5 other people to do it better will actually scale the company and yourself much better.
That's right. That's right. And thank you for sharing that. And that actually is a good segue for a bit of a shift, I think, in our conversation, where I do want to talk a little bit about your book, Take Back Your Power, because as I read through it, I thought you had some really interesting insights about your own leadership journey, but also of others. You've profiled some very high profile leaders in the book about their own leadership journeys as well. And just to open it up, I thought I'd share one thing I thought that was really spoke to me. One of the sections talked about this idea of for many new managers, and they often have this feeling of, as we talked about, imposter syndrome, right? You were so great at what you were doing. Now you feel like you haven't quite gotten your feet underneath you as you've navigated this next level of management and leadership. And I really love this idea that you had said about, instead of calling it imposter syndrome, talk about this idea of exploring and an explorer versus an imposter. Is there anything you can share about that?
Yeah, well, one thing that's really, I think our school system does a disservice for us is that we have this idea that you can get the A, that there's 100%, that there's some objective measure of expertise and mastery. And then you get onto the workforce and everybody's better than you at something. You don't know what it is. And you tend to compare most negatively on the one thing that you're not good at. And I find that people then feel extremely intimidated. These are high-performing people entering the workforce who had gotten the A, graduated with honors, had always just figured out, okay, I've mastered X, I am very good at Y. And suddenly you're thrown into a place where you feel like there's skills that you didn't learn, and there's no easy way to learn them. And I think instead of actually saying, I can't do this, I am unable, or I lack the skills, instead say, I'm going to be a great learner. I'm going to be eager to explore new skills, and treating almost everything as skill building as opposed to what you're lacking is such a different framing that is so empowering. I think I talked to a lot of people, they said, well, but I'm not good at X. And I said, yes, but that is something that you could treat as a skill. Like, for example, I hear a lot of people say, well, I'm very introverted. I'm not good at public speaking. And I said, by the way, one of the biggest biases in the workplace is the ability to speak on a dime, to be able to articulate an idea on a that's what all interviews are. It highly favors people who are able to speak intelligently about anything on a very short notice. Think about that bias and how almost every job interview is that. Every presentation is probably 5-10% of your job, maybe, but it's 90% of how you're judged. And that, so a lot of people come to me and say, well, I'm introverted, or I'm an immigrant, I speak with an accent, I feel uncomfortable, or I'm not good at presentation. And I said, okay, what if you treat it as a skill? You're going to learn how to do it. You're going to go to a Toastmasters class. You're going to, you're going to practice in front of a mirror. And when you reframe it, then people feel they have control. Because when you're an imposter, you feel like you have no control over the situation. So by taking a step back and actually saying, you're giving yourself control back. You're taking back your power and saying, you're going to be able to do this, but you're going to treat it as a skill. that is what I talk about as an explorer. As an explorer, you're always learning. You're always going to be somebody who's seeing new things, and you're always going to be get better the next day. I always talk about if you just get 1% better, a little at a time, you're always moving in the right direction. And so as opposed to staying fixed and saying, well, this is just who I am, I'm just really bad at public speaking. And so I really encourage that kind of learning mindset because this can be so transformative.
Yeah, and I do think that, I tell my kids too, right? Because kids, I think, are notorious for this, where they want to be able to do something really well right away. And they say, oh, I'm not good at this. And I always tell my daughter, well, you're not good at it yet, but everything that you're doing takes time and it takes practice, right? And over time, you will improve. But a lot of that is, I think, languaging. How do you talk to yourself about that? But also, how do you name that out loud and use language that is a bit kinder to yourself, that recognizes that you are in a learning mindset, not necessarily trying to establish expertise right away. You also talk a lot about language, right? And words, and the importance of that in your book. And I do think that that's one of the things that with the coach has been incredible, because what a coach can do is often reflect that back and sometimes name for you. You're using language that feels like it's maybe disempowering you, right? And trying to shift your mindset around thinking or approaching a problem differently.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I read the study once, it said 30% of high school teachers think that they're bad at math.
Oh my
And
gosh.
I think that, if you say, well, I'm bad at math, it's like a natural state. I'm just bad at it. I was born bad at it. But in Asian cultures and in schools, there's a lot of challenges with the way that they teach. But the one thing they do is, no, you just haven't learned it yet. You haven't practiced enough. And so I think we kind of have this fixed idea of like, it's binary, yes or no. You're born being good at math. You're born being a great public speaker. You're born being, I hear people say, well, I'm not technical. And I'm like, what does that even mean? You're not technical, right? It means, does it mean or I'm not data oriented? Well, you can learn those skills. You can actually like force yourself to read, up on how. One person I was helping to transfer to product, he was from data science. He said, he really struggled with the design interview and he failed the interview. And so I said, here's 3 books you need to read, like Design of Everyday Things. I gave him a bunch of design books. I had him mentored by a PM who is very design oriented. And he is now a very successful PM leading a very design oriented product. And you just don't realize that it's learnable. And I think it's that idea of like, are you talking yourself out of doing it? Like you said, right? Often a coach is the person who says, hey, you're thinking about this wrong way. You're framing it the wrong way. What is the way that you would encourage someone else to frame it? And it really kind of gets you out of the doom loop mindset of, I can't do this. I'm bad at math. I'm bad at design. I'm not technical. And instead say, what would it take for me to become more, a bit able to work with technical people? What would it take for me to understand design better? What would it take? And I think that, really reframing that question is so important. And I think coaching does help you do that. It really, as I said, the coach is like, you already know the answer. My job is to I think most of us kind of know what the answer is. But, as I wrote this book, I said, this all seems so obvious, right? As I was writing, I was like, maybe there's just nothing here. But at the same time, I think it's a reminder that there's so many things that we kind of neglect because we get into the wrong mindset. And this is really to change our mindset.
And I also think just that, all of us are carrying a lot, right? And you have so many different priorities, big and small, coming at you every day, that it can be hard, even when you know the answer, to do the thing or to move the way that you want to move. And there is that accountability, I think, that coaching can really bring in a structured way to help you move towards these bigger goals or these bigger rocks that are often hard to do on your own, but can be much easier to do with the right support, with the right nudging, with the right challenge. Deb, I'd love to close on one thought, because you talked about learning, but I also really love this idea of don't give yourself a free pass. And you talk about that in the book as well. And I'd love for you to just share a bit more about that idea and why that's important to you.
Yeah, I borrowed this from an amazing coach that I worked with, Carol Izazaki. And she calls it the unintentional, ridiculous strategies that we employ. Like, you don't go into a meeting and say, I'm going to add no value to this meeting, or I'm going to drain the energy out of the room by sitting in the back and looking grumpy. Like, no one says that, right? But at the same time, how many times have you left a meeting and that's exactly what happens? And part of it is that the work that you're doing is really, be intentional. Like, I think a lot of times the free path is, I'm just going to sit back and not give my opinion. Then why were you there in the first place? Why are you part of the company if you don't, you're going to sit in meetings passively every day? Instead, be proactive. Choose the things you're going to really care about. And the whole thing about the free pass is sometimes we just sit back and say, well, someone else will get to it, and instead, like, choose the things you really care about and be intentional, like, show up. We talk about you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, right?
That's
and
right.
you're not even taking the shot. You're not pitching the idea. You're actually withholding value from the company, from your colleagues, from your customers. And so instead, put yourself out there. You know what? There was a study that said that men and women now negotiate about the same rate. And men, I think they get the raise 20% of the time, and women get it 15% of the time. But if you don't ask, how often are you going to get the raise? 0% of the time. So
That's
whether
right.
or
That's right.
not, I think sometimes we just say, well, I'm probably not going to get the raise. And yeah, probability wise, that's true. But what if you do? And I think sometimes we have this kind of mindset where it's like, I definitely am not going to get it. The odds are against me. Well, absolutely. But 15% of people do get it. So why not go for it? And maybe it's not this time. Maybe you say, okay, you work with your manager. Well, what would it take for me to get a raise? Or what would it take for me to aim for this promotion? And rather than making it a binary, yes or no, say, well, what's the distance between me and getting to where I want to go? Let's work together and enlist them as your ally. I think the free pass is just saying, well, I'm just going to passively. And I talk about some amazing and incredible women who were in extremely high positions who realized that they were actually not asking. They didn't learn to ask for what they wanted, and they were almost passed over. To run the space center, to be the second in command to Willie Brown. Like, these are women who are so incredibly successful who said, wait a minute, I was almost passed over for the biggest opportunity of my life because I didn't ask.
Yeah. And I think that one thing that, I think a lot about, especially as a woman, is that, there are a lot of times where you may not feel like your voice is, going to be of value, or you maybe hesitate before you say something. Or you talked about some stories about sort of sitting on the side of the meeting room instead of really taking your place at that table. And I think that what we've seen is that we absolutely have a lot of value that we can bring to the table. But there, of course, are systems around us sometimes that make that more challenging for women than it may be for others. But certainly, I think, what can we control, right? And what can we really push forward for our own individual career? Always really important to think about, not giving yourself that free pass. Well, Cindy, I know that we wanted to leave some time here for some questions from the audience, but this hour has really flown by, Deb. I could talk about this, for many more hours, but certainly we want to be able to answer some of the questions that might come from the audience as they've, listened along.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. And I know we were chatting before we started the webcast about how valuable I know Sounding Board is to us. And we always learn so much as when you all are on or sponsoring any of our webcasts. And this did not disappoint. It fit right in that same. I even found myself, I giggled a little bit at some of the stories and nodding my head and the language you were using, but also the two of you had such a beautiful conversation. So thank you for that. It was just remarkable. But yes, we do. Pardon me. Now I'm getting choked up. Just kidding. But we do have some questions. My first one, and I'm going to be a little bit selfish here, and then I'm going to turn it over to participants. But one of the things that I was thinking about is, we talk about scaling leadership development, but how would you suggest, or what's your recommendation if we were to scale coaching across an organization, if it's a one-on-one activity? What recommendations might you have for that?
Well, certainly, Cindy, at Sounding Board, that's a solution that we offer. Okay. But I think one of the things that we think is important for companies to think about is, so at Sounding Board, we have not only technology enabled coaching that we can deliver through our global network, and that's in one-on-one and in group coaching models, but we also have SaaS software that our customers can license to be able to stand up their own internal employees as coaches, connect to existing coaches that they already use, but to have that all driven on one unified technology platform. And I think that relates to what Deb was saying earlier, which is now they're looking at lots of different ways that you can enable your managers to be able to have stronger coaching skills. Or it might be connecting you with other peers to be able to peer coach each other and provide that broader support system. But what we're seeing is that companies are really exploring lots of different ways to deliver leader development, and also thinking about how they engage their employee base as part of that, because so much of that knowledge about the company, the strategy, the players, the organizational nuances live within that organization. And so where you can harness that, that can be incredibly powerful for companies.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you for taking that one on first. I'm going to some of the participant questions. And if you've been on a webcast with me, you know I try to kind of pull some together that have some themes. So I'm going to do the same here. So it looks like Jennifer and Morgan both are really interested in what we do to help new managers. So let me just really quickly look through these two. So Morgan very specifically is asking, how do you teach your managers how to coach, for example, their teams? And then let me pop down here. And Jennifer is actually saying, specifically at Sounding Board or Ancestry, what do you do specifically to help managers develop key skills? So kind of one is really, centered on that idea of coaching. The other is just saying key skills, but kind of joining those two together for you all.
Deb, do you want to talk about manager skills? And then I can talk a little bit about coaching.
Yeah, I mean, management is a skill like any other. And I think sometimes we treat it like it's not important, but it's actually one of the most important things that organizations could do is really teach people to be great managers. You're not born being a great manager, just like you're not born being a great coder or a great designer. It's actually a skill like any other. And I think really giving people the opportunity to learn about those things. But most of all, the most important thing as a manager is care. So, a lot of like glid surveys or pulse surveys, people ask my manager shows care. That's one of the most important questions, because you have to start from a place of care. And I think sometimes we realize it's not the person who's technically the most skilled. It's actually the person who can care the most to unblock other people. And I think that that's something which we should screen for in managers is really, are they showing care? Are they there to enable other people? And that is an incredible kind of set point. And without that, and without really emphasizing that to managers, I think you end up in a situation where you have the best technical skill, but maybe that person is a better IC, and that they really care about their craft, but they care less about enabling other people. And so it's really starts at who are you hiring as your managers, who are you promoting into management, but then also having a great IC track and not actually promoting people just because that's the best way to move up in an organization. I think both of those things are really important in all organizations, not just our company or Christine's, but in all companies, really thinking hard about who you're making a manager and what skills you're really looking for.
Perfect.
Yeah, and I think the one thing I will add is just that in terms of coaching skills, one of the things that we saw pretty incredibly consistently at Sounding Board was that as a leader themselves received coaching and experienced that, 60-70% of the leaders we coach are below the executive. So for many of them, this would have been their first exposure to coaching. Very consistently, those managers, because they had experienced the model of coaching, of inquiry, of asking questions versus telling, they were then able to really translate that and bring those coaching skills into their conversations with their team as well. And so certainly We do see that just exposing people to the model in different ways, having them understand what the difference is between being a manager and managing someone, which you still have to do as a manager.
Right.
And then those times when you're a coach, and how do you coach your employee towards conclusions? Experiencing that can be a big power, a sort of driver of being able to do that well.
Yeah, really, really well put. So let me ask you this, and then I'm going to come back to my participants, because what I'm hearing a lot of, and I think it's a little bit of a paradigm shift from what coaching used to be thought of as, or a perception of it. It's no longer just primarily used for leaders who are having problems anymore, is it? It's like made a shift.
Yeah. And Deb, I will still argue, I highly doubt you were the problem employee. But, when Lori, my co-founder, was a coach, this was 25 years ago, it was a bit of that. It was derailed executives. But what we're seeing today is that because coaching is so highly personalized and the development can accelerate so much faster, it now really is a model that companies are thinking about deploying to all of their talent if they can, and certainly their high potential talent.
Yeah. And I think both of you may not have said this exact phrase, but progress over perfection, right? That idea that we're growing and I love, Deb, some of the analogies you used about learning, and we just don't know that yet. We just don't know yet, but we'll get there. Thank you. All right. So coming back to the group here. Oh, I thought this one was, especially as somebody who teaches an analytics course. Tavanisha, and I apologize if I'm butchering your name, but the question is, really great question. How have you seen organizations measure the return on coaching?
So I can certainly talk about that at a high level. One is it depends from organization to organization. So if you talk to someone like Deb, she might have different expectations for some of her executives versus their leader development programs. At Sounding Board, we really focus on this. And so it's all about, one, we look at skill development, actually, right? We've talked a lot today about upskilling and using coaching as a way to skill up these leadership skills. And we can measure that, actually. You can self-assess, you can have peer or manager assess, but that is something that we can track, which is the actual capability and skill building as you go through. We actually also have a lot of companies look at, there is a very well-known model of learning. It's the Kirkpatrick model, and it goes through these different stages of, exposure, engagement, through application and things like that. So you can also look at how well are the skills that they're learning with their coach. Are they translating into their work day to day? And then last, we do have companies that look at very high level metrics around engagement, promotion rates, retention, and attrition, and even looking at leaders that have gotten exposed to coaching. What does that look like compared to those that haven't? But I think there's a lot of creativity in terms of thinking about, well, what's those metrics you're trying to impact as an organization that you've learned from your employee engagement survey, right? Deb talked a lot about care. That can be something that you can try and embed or integrate into your efforts. Anything you want to share there, Deb?
Yeah, I think that for each organization, it's really, are you trying to, for example, are you trying to fix your problem employees, or are you trying to, and I think now it's really about unblocking your best employees and the most highly engaged employees. Like, how do you increase engagement, but also increase productivity? I think a lot of organizations are investing in people who, the 10x employees who can, deliver really great value to your customers, for example. But it's also, it is also really helping those who have high potential. Maybe they're not there yet. They're not at 10x, but you see a lot of potential. And I think it's both potential and performance. And the greatest organizations are the ones who really kind of measure both, like not just who's amazing today, but who can we make amazing tomorrow? Because, if we just unblock them on this one thing, we help them work through this one issue. And I think that that's where a lot of organizations are saying, hey, look, we want to invest in our critical talent. And how do we do that? How do we unblock the people that we think are going to be the leaders of tomorrow, whether they're there today or not?
Mm-hmm. What great. Thank you. Thank you, both of you. That great responses. Like I said, I know, from being a part of a regular part of analytics classes, I know that's a big piece of what's going to be what's our return. If we're investing in this training or resources or have you, what will that look like in return? So, hey, I thought we would finish up with this question. Roberto had asked a question and I thought, I think this will be a really cool question for each of you. If you don't mind, sharing what this means to you, because it's a really great question. The question is, and if I say the word question one more time, but here it is. How has coaching impacted your evolution as a leader? I thought that was a really lovely question to end on.
Deb, you should definitely answer that first.
Well, I would not be where I am today, but for my relationship with Katya. I've also worked with Carol. I've worked with some incredible Sun Yin, like some incredible coaches. And I wrote about all these coaches if you read my post. And it's because it's really kind of unblocking you from the challenges that you have and helping you think through some of the opportunities as well as some of the stumbling blocks that you face. And it's really kind of having somebody to help you, and really, I think sometimes you get in your own head, and what coaching does is it gives you an outside perspective on a difficult challenge that you're facing. And one of the things that I've written extensively about this, is coaching is a voice that kind of gives you perspective. And I think that has been incredible. And as Katya said the first time we meet, she said, "You'll be CEO one day." And she said that, by the way, for 9 years.
Oh my gosh.
I would absolutely not be here without the coaches I've worked with. And, I have had amazing coaches, and Katya has been the main one, but I've also worked with Sonia Singh and Carol Saki, and they have been just transformative in helping me think through some of the big challenges that I faced, and as well as how I see the world.
Well, I know we were over time. That was an incredible anecdote. I will just say, look, I got so much from it. I started an entire company so I could deliver the model to more people earlier in their careers. So
yeah, that's pretty poignant.
But thank you so much for the time, everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, we've loved having you both, Christine and Deb, and what a great way to send us off for our Wednesday afternoon. So it was such a pleasure to have the both of you with us today. Just a reminder to HCI members, today's webcast has been approved for HRCI and SHRM credit, as well as for HCI recertification. Your credits for attending this webcast will soon show up in your My HCI profile under the transcript tab. While you're there, don't forget to check out hci.org for even more insights, as well as information on our certifications, virtual conferences, premium membership, and more. Of course, one more big thank you to our presenters, Deb and Christine, as well as our sponsor, Sounding Board. It's such a pleasure to have you all with us today. And a final thank you to you, our webcast viewer. We, of course, couldn't do it without you. Thanks for spending the hour with us. We'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.